This is Research Like a Pro, Episode 14, Lucinda Keaton Case Study. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hello and welcome to Research Like a Pro. We're excited to be here today to discuss a case study with you. I'm Nicole Dyer and I'm here with Diana. How are you today, Diana?
I'm doing great. Thank you. And I'm excited to talk to you today about your case study. And I love it that this is also one of my case studies because this is my ancestor as well, since you're my daughter. Awesome.
Yeah, Mom.
So today we're going to talk about Nicole's work on Lucinda Keaton. Nicole, can you just give us a little background info on why you even wanted to research this ancestor?
Sure. That's a good question. I hadn't really thought about saying this, but when we first started researching on Grandpa Schultz's line, one of the people that we were trying to find was his great-grandmother, Melissa Welch. And we thought her name was Melissa Welch, and we thought maybe Melissa was like a nickname for Elizabeth, and we weren't really sure. And so we kind of had a little bit of difficulty nailing down her parents. I got confused, and I thought her parents were a man named Meredith Welch. And so we had linked her up incorrectly. And then years later, when I came back to it, I discovered the error and found her real parents. So Melissa Welch's real parents we found were George Welch and his wife named Lucinda. And I was excited because I hadn't heard these names before, and I really wanted to find Lucinda's maiden name. So I worked for a long time on discovering everything I could about George Welch and Lucinda and all of their migration from Alabama to Texas. And I eventually learned that they originated in South Carolina. And Lucinda's maiden name was only available on one of the death certificates of her children. She had many children, but only one of them lived long enough to have a detailed death certificate listing the mother's maiden name. And it was actually kind of hard to read. I thought it said Keston at first, but after doing some searches for the last name Keston, I didn't find a lot. So it didn't seem like a real surname that anyone had. And then I looked at it again and realized that it probably said Keaton, Keaton. And that's how I realized that I had been looking at the wrong thing. So Lucinda Keaton. And I, of course, as soon as I found out her maiden name was Keaton, I wanted to find out who her parents were. And from the censuses that she appeared on, she went by several different names. Lucinda, also Cinderella or Cinderella. And there was even one census that I think is where her name is recorded as Cynthia, which I think is just the informant was giving information that was inaccurate. But the names and the place of birth were all kind of all over the place. I didn't know much about where she was born, but I thought maybe it was in South Carolina or somewhere in the South. And with the name Keaton, I had some good clues to start with. So when I found her daughter's marriage record, so George and Lucinda's eldest daughter, Margaret, when I found that she was married in South Carolina in a place called Pendleton Factory, I thought, perfect. This is the exact clue of location that I need to find Lucinda's father and mother, because I now know that there was a location within South Carolina that was more specific, and that was Pendleton Factory. And I didn't know what Pendleton Factory was. Is it a town or a county? This was a marriage notice in a newspaper called the Pendleton Messenger. And so the Pendleton Messenger was in what's now Anderson County, but what was Pendleton District when South Carolina had districts. So I knew that I had a lot to learn because I didn't know much about researching in South Carolina. And I kept that marriage record for a long time without really knowing what to do with that. And when I came back to it, I Google searched Pendleton Factory and found an old county history that said that that place was near 23 Mile Creek. So then I thought, well, if I can just find an old map that shows where 23 Mile Creek is, then maybe I can find where Pendleton Factory is within South Carolina, because it wasn't on Google Maps, Pendleton Factory. There was a Pendleton town. So I thought maybe it was that. Anyways, so when I looked at an old map in the Dave Rumsey map collection, I found the 23 Mile Creek near the town of Pendleton. And I also found that it was near a place called Gresham's Mill. And so remember that, Gresham's Mill. And then I decided to start looking into different family trees to see if I could find any more clues about Keatons in that area. And about that same time, I noticed that Lucinda's husband, George Welch, was enumerated on the 1830 census in Anderson County, South Carolina. So I had all this evidence pointing to Lucinda and her husband living in Anderson County, which included the town of Pendleton in South Carolina. And I also saw on that 1830 census that there were 3 households away from George Welch and Lucinda was a man named Archibald Keaton. And I thought, oh, I wonder who that man is. And he looked like he was about the same age as George and Lucinda. So I wondered if he was a brother to Lucinda. And I just really held on to that evidence as like really good evidence for somebody that could be in her family, because he was a neighbor. And as you know, friends, associates, and neighbors are very good clues. So I had all this evidence of Anderson and Pendleton County being the right place. And then I went and looked at some ancestry trees for Archibald Keaton to see if it had any information about his parents, because there was definitely nothing out there about Lucinda's parents. And I found an ancestry tree that someone had created with Archibald Keaton being linked to the parents named William Keaton and Katie Gresham. And I thought, oh, Gresham, that was on the map that I saw, Gresham's Mill, which is where Lucinda's daughter was married nearby in Pendleton Factory. So I was getting excited thinking, okay, Katie Gresham, William Keaton, are these the candidates for parents here? And so I had this idea that they were the candidates for her parents. And then I found a DNA match, an ancestry DNA match, who was a descendant of Katie Gresham's parents, Barbara Burdine and John Gresham. So that was just another piece of evidence that got me really thinking that this was the right track. So, wow, that was a lot of background info.
So there's a few things that I picked out of that as you were talking. So one of the things that you said was that you finally got a location, and that was really important. So, you know, if someone is researching their family and they don't have a specific place to start with their locality research, do you have any ideas about what they can do with that?
Yes, I think the thing that worked the most for me was trying to find Lucinda's husband on a census in South Carolina, because I thought she was born there, and I think he was born there also. So I thought, you know, because I had him on a census in Alabama in 1850 with all their children, and that's how I knew that Melissa Welch was the daughter of Lucinda Keaton and George Welch. And all I knew was that they were born in South Carolina. And so searching in the 1840 and 1830 censuses, I searched for George Welch in South Carolina and found him in Anderson County, and that was the only match. So I got lucky because there was only one, but then I continued and found their daughter got married there also in a newspaper announcement. And I actually found that in a book. It was a derivative and kind of an index that somebody had created from marriage and death notices from the Pendleton Messenger. And I found that in the family history library on one of our trips there when we were looking for more information on this family. So yeah, I did. You could compile a list of all the people with your ancestor's name within those census records and then start researching each one, I guess. But I got lucky that there was only one, George Welch, in South Carolina in 1830 and 1840.
Yeah, that is lucky because Welch is kind of a common name there in South Carolina, if I remember right. And George is certainly, not an unusual name. So you were lucky. And I have had that happen a lot where I'm trying to research and I don't know where to start. And I have to maybe go through a few different census records and do a little research on each of the men to try to figure it out if it could be the right ancestor. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, figuring out a locality sounds like it was really key for this project. So what did you do next? It sounds like you had all these things, you'd found all these different clues. You'd found the marriage record and the census, and you had this ancestry tree and a DNA match, and you kind of had this idea that they were the parents. So how did you go about actually proving this?
Well, we started the Research Like a Pro study group, and it was the third time that it would have been my third time. So I thought, well, I think I'm ready to try this difficult project now. And so I decided to make it my study for the study group, my project for the study group. So I took all the information that I had found and created an objective, which was to determine if William Keaton was the father of Lucinda Keaton. So I'll read the whole objective that I started with. I started with this. Determine if William Keaton, born about 1756 to 1765 and married Katie Gresham in Pendleton, South Carolina, was the father of Lucinda Keaton Welch. Lucinda was born about 1805 in South Carolina and married George Welch. And then after I wrote that objective, some of the feedback I got from the study group members was that maybe I could add some more details about Lucinda's marriage date and place and death info if available, but neither of them were available. There was no marriage record that we could find or a death date or any death information because they moved to Texas and they were living in the frontier. So there wasn't a cemetery record that I could find or anything like a death certificate. So I didn't really have any more details, but I did decide to add one more sentence to the end of my objective to make it a little bit more unique. And so I added to the end of it that Lucinda and George resided in Anderson District, South Carolina in 1830.
And that was a good addition because in our objectives, we want to have, enough information that we're uniquely identifying them. We don't want to put everything into it, right? Because you're going to have a lot of stuff in the background material that doesn't need to go in the objective, but you just want to give people a real view of what's going on with this family in the objective. And my kind of criteria for creating an objective is if I were hired to do this research project, would I be able to do the research based on the objective? Is there enough information for me to go to work? So good job. I think that you did a great job on that objective. It clearly gives us dates and places and relationships. So what did you do next after you did your objective?
Well, the next assignment in the study group was to do the analysis. So I got out my timeline that I had already made for Lucinda Keaton and I kind of updated it because I wanted to review everything that I had already found about her and make sure that I had all of the clues about her life and her children so I could connect her back to the next generation. So I had already had that done. And then I realized that, if I'm doing a project about William Keaton, I need to really dive into learning about him and create a timeline and chronology for everything that I found about him already. So I had found some information about him that I hadn't known what to do with because I didn't feel like I had proven that he was Lucinda's father yet. So I didn't want to put it into my database yet or family search yet. So I had just kind of been saving a lot of things to Evernote. And so I had all these clues, but they were scattered. And so I decided to make a timeline with everything I had about him and then also a chronology with everything really detailed out, all the analysis about all of his friends, associates, and neighbors, and all of the details of each source and kind of going into what kind of information is this and what kind of source is this so that I could really type out a lot more details than you can in a timeline. So I used both and they were both really helpful for spotting inconsistencies and things. And I didn't really find a lot of inconsistencies, but what I did find was a really good idea for what to research next. So let me tell you what I found. So in my timeline and chronology, I first focused on estimating a birth year range for William because I really wanted to have a unique identifier for his estimated birth range. So what I had to do, I had located him on all of the census records from 1790 to 1820, living in Pendleton District or Pendleton County because it changed from a county to a district and then back again. Anyway, it was confusing, but he was there in the same place the whole time. And using the 1790 census, where he was over 16 years old, all I had from that was that he was born before 1774, but he already had 5 kids, so I knew he was born quite a bit before then. And then in the 1800 census, the range was between 26 and 45 years old. So that gave me a better range of his birth. So he was probably born about 1756 to 1774. And then in the 1810 census, when he was over 45 years old, that really helped narrow the birth year range down. So if he was over 45 in 1810, he was born before 1765. So now I have a birth year range of born between 1756 and 1765. So about a 9-year window.
Yeah, that was really a helpful explanation of how you could do that, because those early census records can be kind of tricky to use. Mm-hmm. And there are a couple of online helps that can do that. There are websites that I've seen them where you can plug in your numbers, and if you're not so great at math and can't figure out exactly when somebody would have been born, if they're a certain age in a certain year, there's a great website that you just plug that in and it gives you the range right there, and you don't have to do the thinking, because sometimes my brain gets kind of tired and I don't want to have to do the math. I know you're really good at math, but for anyone that's just thinking, oh, that sounds so complicated. So we'll put a link in the show notes to a couple of websites that are really great for helping you estimate really quickly, those ranges of dates. Did you use a table or anything to kind of keep track of that as you were formulating that?
I used a calculator, actually, and yes, I just wrote down everything in a document. So I think I was using my chronology to do that. So in my chronology, I did an extraction of all the data from each census. And so I just put the tally marks in there. And then underneath the table in my chronology, I just typed out kind of some notes from it. So my conclusions from that census were that he was born between 1756 and 1774. And then when I was all done extracting all the data from each census, then I just put all the year ranges into a little table and figured out that the most narrow range that I had was, 1756 to 1765.
And that is a good narrow range. That's an excellent narrow range. And one thing I might mention too is that sometimes you'll get a conflicting census. I've had that happen a lot where they didn't seem to age. They're 20 to 30 in 1 year, 10, and then 10 years later, they're still 20 to 30. And so just like with the censuses after 1850, where the information can be incorrect at times, we have to keep that in mind. There might be the wrong tally mark sometimes.
For sure. For sure. Another thing that helped me with that was looking at how many children he had. So I figured out that he must have had 13 total children based on the 1790 through the 1820 censuses, because in 1790 he had 5 children. And this is just assuming that he, was listed with his wife and his children, in his household. It could have been nieces and nephews, who knows, but just going with the most likely possible situation, I guessed that he had a wife and 5 children in the 1790 census. And then in the 1800 census, there were 10 children in his household. And then in the so that was 1800. And then in 1810, there were still 10 children, but 3 of them were born within the last 10 years because they were ages 0 to 10. So that's how I deduced that those 3 children were new. So then there were 13 children total. And I did a lot of work with that, trying to make sure that I was getting that right. But this was really helpful for me later, knowing that he had probably 13 children. So I'll talk about that more when we get later on. But also I used his children and his estimated birth year range to then estimate a marriage range, kind of when he got married, because I wanted to have an estimate for that as well. I just thought that would help me to kind of get a timeline down. So then I looked at his children. He had 5 children in 1790. And I figured that if he was born about 1756 to 1765, then 20 years later would have been about 1776 to 1785. About 1780, I guessed, would be a good marriage date. So if he was married in 1780, he would have been about 20 years old. And if he had 5 children between 1780 and 1790, then that was plausible because they could have had children every 2 years. So that was kind of how I came up with the 1780 marriage estimate for him and his wife.
Good. So if someone has got an ancestor and they've got all these different censuses, but they don't have any birth records or marriage records, just using that census information, they could create a timeline for an individual, right? With birth, marriage, children. And then that would really help them to, as they're looking at other records, try to put those children into place in the family and can give a lot of clues, right?
Right. Yeah. And it really was just my hypothesis. I knew that I was using information that was just guesstimates, but I wanted to have a framework to start with as I started searching for more records. So if I knew that he was about 20 in 1780 and that's about when they got married, then I could, look for more records that could prove that hypothesis in that time and place.
Right. And that's really important because somebody wouldn't own land if they were 10 years old. Having an appropriate or an approximate date for when they were able to start being taxed on land and owning land, that makes a big difference in seeing if the record matches the person.
Mm-hmm.
So what did you do next? You had to go after some other records, or I'm guessing you had some other research that came to mind?
Yes, some of those documents that I had saved to Evernote but had not known what to do with included a land record, which was a conveyance from Nicholas Welch to William Keaton in Pendleton. And the name Welch is the name of George Welch, which is Lucinda's husband. So I thought, wow, is this another friend, associate, or neighbor that's connected to the family? Is this Welch name connected to William Keaton, giving me some evidence here that these two families were connected? Because I was trying to prove that my Lucinda Keaton Welch was connected to William Keaton. And here's a record showing William Keaton connected to a Nicholas Welch in Pendleton. So another clue that gave me was that William Keaton owned land. And so I thought, okay, great. I have a landowner. He's going to have some more records. If he died, there should be a will or an estate division or some kind of sale of his land. And then I noticed that he wasn't on the 1830 census. So I wondered if he had either moved or died. So that negative evidence of him not appearing on the 1830 census in Pendleton, where he had lived for the last 40 years, was a good clue to me that he had died. And then the biggest clue that I noticed when I put together my timeline was an 1833 land conveyance from a William Keaton and a George Welch to a Whitefield Anthony. So those two men, William Keaton and George Welch, were conveying land together. And at first I was confused because the record mentioned that William Keaton was deceased. And I thought, well, how can a deceased person convey land to another person? But then I thought maybe that's why George Welch was also on the record. So William Keaton and George Welch were conveying the land. But then I realized that it was two people named William Keaton. And although it didn't say William Keaton Jr. and William Keaton Sr., it was that way. So William Keaton, who was deceased, was likely the father of the William Keaton and George Welch who were conveying the land. So this, again, was another huge clue to me that I was on the right track and that Lucinda's husband, George Welch, was conveying land together with William Keaton, the land where the deceased William Keaton Sr. was residing. And it gave me a hint that I was right, that William Keaton already had died.
Right. And it's really interesting that you brought up the point about the junior and senior, because a lot of times when we're researching in the records, we will find a name like that, William Keaton, and throughout the records, we'll have junior and senior. And then sometimes it will change and you don't have junior or senior. And then sometimes you will have junior become the senior. And so it can be really confusing if you've got these men of the same name. And one thing to keep in mind that I have learned is that junior and senior didn't always mean that they were father and son. It could just mean one was the older gentleman in the county and the other was the younger gentleman in the county of that name. They could be uncle and nephew, or they could be cousins. It's just the way that the clerks would designate who was the older and who was the younger. And sometimes it would change as, the years went by. So it can be really helpful when we have those to just do exactly what you did, this analysis and trying to sort out the people of the same name with those juniors and seniors. So it sounds like you've got some really good clues that you're on the right track, but then you had to do some other steps. What was the next thing that you did?
Well, the next step in the study group was to create a locality guide. And I was excited for this because I knew that the districts changed into counties and that South Carolina was a little bit difficult for that reason. So I decided to create 2 locality guides for this assignment. I did a South Carolina locality guide where I just learned about all the records that were within the state and all the information about South Carolina. And then I did a specific one about Pendleton. So I initially entitled it the Pendleton District Locality Guide. But now that I look at it, I'm realizing that I was talking mostly about the town of Pendleton and then how the jurisdictions kind of changed around that encompassed Pendleton. So I realized that the town of Pendleton is kind of where I wanted to focus my research because that's really where they lived. And then I needed to figure out which counties and districts had the records for that town, depending on all the boundary changes. Because South Carolina, they had these overarching districts for a while that was just another jurisdiction. They contained counties for a while. And so from 1789 to 1791, Pendleton town was part of Pendleton County, which was also part of 96th District. And so when I figured that out, I was able later on to find a land record for William Keaton in the 1790s. And I think it was in the 1790s in the 96th District record office. So I needed to know that information. And then in 1791, the 96th District was split. And the new overarching district for Pendleton County was Washington District. And then in 1798, Washington District was renamed Pendleton District. So you can imagine this was just really confusing going through all these details. And then in 1800, South Carolina got rid of all the overarching districts and abolished that. And every county was just called a district. So then after that, the area was known as Pendleton District for a while. So from 1800 to 1826, it was Pendleton District. And then in 1826, Pendleton District was abolished and divided into 2 different counties, Anderson District and Pickens District. And then, of course, later, South Carolina stopped using the word district and they just used the word county, so Anderson County. So I learned a lot in my locality assignment. It was kind of a mess to tangle through, but I really learned a lot about the history of South Carolina.
Wow. If I am correct, I am counting 6 different jurisdictions that you would have to research for the life of William Keaton. That's probably a record. That's so amazing. So, when you have a situation like that, what was your best way of figuring that out? Did you go look at maps? Did you use the Family Search Wiki? I mean, can you remember what you used to try to sort all of that out? Because that was very confusing.
Yes. And I even found some sources that didn't explain it correctly or didn't know, that were a little bit off. And so I used a mix of sources. I used a bunch of maps. What helped the most were maps that had the dates. So I found some maps that said 1789 to 1791. So you could see that there was an overarching district encompassing a county. And that helped a lot. And then I found the Family Search Wiki was good, but then I found some even better, more detailed information. So
basically, for your locality guide, you put together the best of everything you could find out there in a format that made sense to you, that you could really understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, you probably should submit that to the Family Search Wiki because this probably would be a great help for other people that are working on that. I think it's so interesting that you decided that your locality guide was really about a town, because a lot of times with our locality guides, we recommend doing a state guide or a county guide, but I've never done a town guide, but I love that that turned out to be kind of a town guide. That's really interesting. So, anybody who's listening, just know that your locality guides need to be dovetailed to what you need for whatever research project you're doing. And like Nicole
Right.
said, she did a little South Carolina one, but then she also really had to hone in on this particular location.
I wanted the locality guide to be about the place where my family lived, where the Keatons lived, and they didn't live in Washington or 96th district for very long, or Washington. So doing a locality guide for those districts wasn't going to be helpful. So
good. Okay, what was your next step? You've done your objective, you've done your analysis of all of your research, and then you've created your locality guide. So I'm sure that now that you did that locality guide, you had lots and lots of ideas. And from your analysis, you had lots and lots of ideas of things you wanted to research. So did you just go start and do web surfing to search your family, or what did you do next?
that's what I would have done if I hadn't been in the study group. But because the next assignment was to create a research plan, I had to rein it in and create a plan. And I decided to really try to do this really well. So I worked really hard on my research plan to try to figure out exactly what would be the best way to look for the answer to my question. So I revised my objective a tiny bit by adding in some more of those details that I had figured out with the estimated death of William Keaton. So then I knew that my plan was going to include looking for information about his death and what happened to his land after he died. So in the locality guide assignment, I had found several collections that I wanted to search in. And one of them was Anderson County wills from 1791 to 1834. And also Anderson County estate papers packets from 1828 to 1915. And I was so happy that it was 1828 to 1915 because that was just in time for the death of William Keaton, who I think died, right before the 1830 census sometime, because I know he was alive in 1826 and then he wasn't there in 1830. So I was hoping that he was going to be included in this record set. And so I also found out some connections that the family was part of the Methodist Church, and I thought they might have some records that could include William Keaton and that might show, family records, a link to his daughter. And then I found, when I was creating the newspaper section of my Pendleton locality guide, I was so excited to find that there was a digitized newspaper for that time period available about Pendleton District. And it was called the Pendleton Messenger. And I had found that marriage record for Lucinda's daughter in that book, which was an extract from this. But this was a database with images at Genealogy Bank for the newspaper with its prior name, which was Miller's Weekly Messenger from 1807 to 1841. So Pendleton Messenger before was called Miller's Weekly Messenger. And all I needed to do was get a subscription to Genealogy Bank, and I could do a surname search for Keaton. And I was so excited to do this that honestly, I didn't even wait until I finished my research plan to search this and get the subscription. So I got the subscription and I went right away and searched in that database and typed in Keaton and found something exciting.
Oh, you cheated. No,
cheated. I know.
Sometimes we just can't resist if there's something right there.
Well, I was just a newbie at the research planning process, so I'm better now.
So you found all of these great sources and you had all these ideas. Did you do a certain order for those?
I did. So what I did was, after I had made a huge list, I chose just the ones, like the top 6 that I thought could answer my question about if he had an estate or if he died and split the land. And I made that list and there were like 6 of them. And then I decided to look and see which one was the most easy to access And then I gave it a number priority based on that and what type of evidence I thought it could provide. So if I thought it could provide direct evidence, I gave it a higher priority list. And so my number one that I thought would be easy to do and provide direct evidence, I thought would be a church record if it would exist. So I right away emailed the depository archivist for the Methodist Church at Wofford University. And then the next thing that I wanted to do was to check that database with images of the Miller's Weekly Messenger newspaper. So that was my number two. And then the number three was an index to judgment rolls at the court there in Pendleton District from 1800 to 1899. And I thought that it might have some mention of the Keatons in there that could give me some more indirect evidence. And it was online. So that was one of the reasons why I placed it as higher priority, because it was indexed and it was online. And then my next search that I wanted to do was in that Anderson County wills. And there were some images online that I could go through on Family Search. And usually those volumes are indexed at the front. So I thought it would be pretty accessible. And then the next one, the Anderson County Estate Papers and Packets from 1828 to 1915. I really wanted to look in that, but it was at the Family History Library on microfilm and it wasn't digitized. So I had to ask you to do that search for me. So I didn't put it as my number one because it was going to take some effort and I had to wait till you could go do a research trip. So I wanted to do the other ones first to see if it could help find the answer before that. And then I had another random index to commissioners' former files. It was an obsolete index of Pendleton and Anderson in 1820, and I thought it might have the Keatons on there. So I put that on my list as well. So those are my top 6 ideas for things to research.
Okay, good. That's very helpful. So taking into account how easy it was to research, so whether it was online or if you had to actually go to the Family History Library, that made a difference. And then also you tried to just organize it by if you could easily get the answer, right? If you'd gone to church records and then they had a baptismal record or whatever, that stated parents, then you would have had your answer right there, right?
Right.
So it's really good for us to think then, isn't it, about strategizing our research plan and putting the things that are most likely to have the answer to our research question and the most likely, ease of accessibility, able to find it. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it sounds like you had a really varied research plan here too, because you had church records, newspaper, you had court records, you had the probate. So you were going after some unusual records also, right? You had already done census research and your answer wasn't there. You had to start digging into some of the things that are a little bit more difficult, which is what we have to do.
Right. And I had found most of these I found by looking in the Family Search catalog. And that's how I even knew that they existed, which was part of the project, the assignment to do the locality guide. So in creating the locality guide, that's where I even learned about these sources, or else I wouldn't have even known to look here. I mean, of course, I knew that there's a possibility of having probate records or wills or estate packets, but then actually going into the Family Search catalog and typing in Pendleton District in Anderson County, that's where I learned, they have a collection of estate packets starting in 1828.
Yeah, the Family Search catalog, I start all my research projects right there in the locality I'm researching, because who knows, all these different little record types exist, especially the one that's titled Obsolete Index to Commissioners' Former Files. I mean, there are some really interesting records out there, and the catalog is such a fabulous place to find things just for your locality. So that's one of my biggest tips that I always give anyone who's working on a project, is to go check out that and see if there's some records you haven't thought of.
Right.
Okay, so now you've got your plan. Now I'm assuming that the next step is you're finally going to get to research all these fun records, right?
Right. So I emailed, the first person on my plan was to email the Methodist Church archivist, and he responded and said that the archives don't have anything for that church, but that I could contact the church itself if it's still in use. So I did that, but I didn't hear back. So it might take just visiting that place or trying to get a phone number and calling them. But I have a feeling that they don't have records for that time period since it was so long ago. So then the next step, like I said, was to do that digitized newspaper search, which I had jumped the gun on and did it right away. And before I finished my research plan. And that was when I just hit the jackpot. I found a notification of an estate sale for William Keaton. And the notification appeared in the Pendleton Messenger on November 17th, 1830. And it had a listing of all of the defendants who lived outside of the state of South Carolina. So it did not list Lucinda Keaton, but it did list several other Keaton siblings who lived outside of the state. So it said South Carolina Anderson District, Archibald Keaton, applicant versus Abner Keaton et al. Defendants. It appearing to my satisfaction that Abner Keaton, Jesse Keaton, Reuben Keaton, James Keaton, Ephraim Keaton, Andrew Keaton, William Rives and Sally his wife, and Reuben Hannah and Polly his wife, defendants in this case, reside without this state. It is therefore ordered that they do appear and object to the division or sale of the real estate of William Keaton on or before the first Monday of January next, or their consent to the same will be entered of record. And then it has John Harris, OAD, November 17th, 1830. And the OAD stands for Ordinary of Anderson District. It took me a while to figure that out, but once I started looking in the court records, I realized that they called him the Ordinary of the court, meaning the judge for that district.
Wow, that newspaper listed so many people. That's amazing. And I think that's such a great example of how newspaper research can fill in the blanks and give so many great details. Imagine having all those people named that are outside the state. You would never know to look for that. So good job.
Right.
What else did you find?
Well, after I saw that, I thought, okay, now I know there is a division or sale of the real estate of William Keaton on file in the court records of Anderson District in 1830. So I knew exactly what to do next. And that was to have you go up to the Family History Library and go look in those Anderson County estate papers and packets to find the packet for William Keaton in 1830. So I did check the next two things on my research plan, which were the judgment rolls and the Anderson County wills, but didn't find anything, no Keatons in those. So then I waited patiently while you took your next research trip to Salt Lake. It was only a few days later. I think it was just like the next day. I got so lucky.
Yeah, you did. Well, and that was an interesting experience too, because you had given us just your parameters. You know, you had a date that you thought, and you had a name. And it's always tricky going into a repository, trying to figure out how the records will be organized. And in this case, it was on microfilm. And we looked at the microfilm and we could not make sense of how they had organized it. It just, it just was not making sense until all of a sudden I realized it was alphabetical and they were just going through all the surnames. And so when we finally figured that out, then we were like, okay, Keaton. So we quickly got to the Keatons, and it was really exciting that right there was William Keaton, because you didn't know for sure if there would be an estate packet. I mean, we thought there would be since there was the notice in the newspaper, and then it turned out to have 56 images. So, of course, when I'm researching at the Family History Library for myself or for a client like Nicole, you know, I do an image of every single document that's on there. And so we did 56 images, and I could tell she was going to have some work cut out because there was a lot of transcribing to do. So I came home, put that all on Dropbox, I believe. And then what did you get to do next?
Well, of course, you don't want to sit down and start transcribing. You just like the fun thing to do is just to page through it as fast as possible to look for the name Lucinda somewhere in the document. So of course I'm looking, and the handwriting is really difficult to read. And I'm hoping there's going to be somewhere on this estate packet that names all of his children and that Lucinda is there. And I finally got to one of the images that had a list of a whole bunch of children. So I was looking at each child's name very carefully. And I finally found one. I found George Welch, and it was the listing, like Ephraim Keaton, Abner Keaton. And then there was George Welch and his wife. And then the name was just really hard to read. And I stared at it for a while. And I thought, this looks like it says Lucinda, but it has some extra L's at the end. What is this saying? And in my mind, I'm thinking, does it say Cinderella? Because I know she went by Cinderella or Cinderella. And so I'm thinking, maybe it says Lucinda, maybe it says Cinderella, but it looks like it starts with an L, but it ends with Illa. So I have Lucindrilla. And I finally realized that it said her name is Lucindrilla. And it made sense that she had gone by both Lucinda and Cinderella at that point, because I knew now that her full name really was Lucindrilla. But then I questioned myself and said, well, hold on. Is Lucindrilla a name? Is that a real name? And so I had to do a search I just went to the 1850 census and typed in Lucindrilla without any surname, just to see if that was any name that, any other person had. And sure enough, there were 2 other women in 1850 that had the name Lucindrilla. So I thought, great, now I know that this is a real name at least.
Yeah. Isn't that such an interesting name? And I remember when we first discovered that her granddaughter or great-granddaughter was named Margaret Cinderella. And we thought that was so cool. That was such a fun name. So it's really awesome to figure out where that name came from, that she was named for her, I guess, was it her grandmother or great-grandmother? I'm trying to think generations
yes, let's talk about the naming pattern here. So our great-great-grandmother, Melissa Welch, named one of her daughters Margaret Cinderella. So Margaret Cinderella's grandmother was Lucinda Keaton. And now we're just finding out, Lucinda's full name is Lucindrilla. So it makes sense that, Melissa named her daughter after her mother.
Okay. That's neat. Well, I love that we have a Lucindrilla in our ancestry.
I know. If I ever have more kids, now I have a great name to use, right?
Lucindrilla, and then it can be short. It can be Lucy. That'd be such a cute name.
Or Cinderella.
Or Gorilla. Nice. Oh, fun. Well, that is just an awesome project. And you found out all of this stuff in your research as you were logging your research, keeping your research log. And of course, you were doing your good source citations all along, making your discoveries. But then what did you have to do? Because someone else maybe would not be able to follow this research if you didn't do the final step, which is writing up your report. So what happened when you went to write all this up?
Well, it's good that you mentioned that someone else might not follow this, because there was a cousin that got in touch with me on Family Search when I started adding my conclusions and said, hey, why are you adding this? I don't know, I don't understand the connection between her relative, which was Archibald Keaton, and William Keaton being the father. So she wanted to know, how did I get that evidence? So I did have to send her my report and all of my conclusions. So I wrote a report detailing everything that I had found, starting with the newspaper article notification of his estate sale. And then I really did go in and transcribe every single page image that you sent me from his estate packet. And I used a Google document and I transcribed each one on a separate page. And so I could keep them all separate. And as I did that, I felt very lucky, because out of all 56 images, there was only one that mentioned Lucindrilla. The other images mentioned the men only. So it mentioned George Welch several times, which was a good clue too, because it was her husband. And it mentioned all the other sons and sons-in-laws several times, but it only mentioned the daughters on that one page, which was it was a notification that the ordinary had given about all the heirs appearing at the court. So that notification that all of the heirs of William Keaton needed to appear at the court was the only page that mentioned all of the names of each child. So I'm really glad that that was included in the estate packet, because it also named some sisters that I hadn't heard of, like Lucindrilla's sister Mariah, who lived in South Carolina. So she wasn't in the newspaper notification for people who lived outside of South Carolina. So anyways, taking all of the records that I'd found, which really were just the newspaper article and this estate packet, and taking all the evidence, I wrote a report and included everything that I found that linked Lucindrilla and her husband George Welch to William Keaton and Catherine Gresham, which she was mentioned by name in the packet as well as Catherine. So I had already known that she might have gone by Catherine and Katie. So that was helpful. and she was listed as the widow, and then all of the heirs were listed as his children and mentioned. And so I really wanted to find somewhere in the estate packet that said that the heirs were children, because sometimes the heirs can be nieces and nephews. And I wanted to make sure that these were actually his children. And so another thing that helped me at that point, which I included in the report, was how many children I thought he had, which was 13 children based on the census records. And after going through all the names that were listed in this estate packet, I found that there were 13 children listed in the estate packet as well. So it helped me to have those two pieces of evidence that went together, tied together, and made a connection that this family had been put together correctly with the information and evidence that I had. So it kind of confirmed for me that I did it right.
That really came full circle from your beginning research, where you were trying to sort out the family and just trying to estimate who was in this family, to finding the records and then fitting them to what you'd estimated. So that is this has been such an interesting case study about how you took a question that you've been having for years and had found some things, and then you finally focused on it in this project and found your answer, which is why we love the Research Like a Pro process, because it does help you make progress. So what are you going to do next with this family? Do you have any ideas for future research or anything else that you want to do?
Oh, so many ideas for future research, because I found out in my locality guide part, in my assignment for creating the locality guide, that the land in Pendleton District was granted to veterans of the Revolutionary War. So I know that he had some land there in about 1790, and I want to know how he got that, if he was in the war, because he was the right age. If he was born in 1760, he would have been about 16 to 20 during the Revolutionary War. So he could have been a soldier. So I really want to go after that and see what I can find out about that. And another thing that I want to do is learn more about each of the siblings of Lucinda. And I did find a family tree on Roots Web after I had made all my discoveries. I had found this after, that had a transcription of that one page in the estate packet that I found with all the children. But Lucinda's name was not transcribed as Lucinda or Lucindrilla or Cinderella. It was transcribed as Drusilla. And so I'm glad that I didn't find that record before, because it might have thrown me off to see, oh, William Keaton's daughter is named Drusilla. Oh, okay, that might not be my relative. If I would have seen that, I could have said, this is a derivative. I need to get the original record and see what it actually says. And then I could have figured out that it said Lucindrilla. But I'm glad that I didn't use that derivative, because it would have been confusing to just hear the name Drusilla.
Right. That's a really good example of always going to the original, because when you know your family, you can see the names better in that old handwriting. It just can make more sense. So I'm so glad you figured it out, that it's Lucindrilla, and that you've got more ideas. I think the Revolutionary War era sounds fascinating for researching William Keaton and seeing, if he did serve. And then, of course, there's always going back to the next generation, right? Because now you've discovered we've got Katie Gresham and William Keaton. So now we've got the Greshams, which is always so fun, because once you discover the parents of an ancestor, then you've got two new lines to research. So, I don't understand how people can say their research is all done, because we have so many lines that can be researched. And when we figure out one brick wall, then we have two more that open up for us.
Right. That's so true. And there's actually a pretty good consensus among researchers about Katie Gresham's parents, but I would like to find the original records that prove it. But it is exciting, because I did have that DNA match that shows we are related to Katie Gresham's parents, Barbara Burdine and John Gresham. So all of those names are in the Revolutionary War era, and some of them are supposed to be soldiers from the war. So I really want to join Daughters of the American Revolution at some point. So I'm hoping that I can find some good evidence to be able to use this line to get into that lineage society, because I've already done so much research proving my relationship to William Keaton. So I just need one more step back to get, if I can just prove that he was a soldier, then I can be done and submit my application.
Right. And then you could submit my application too. Because we can prove our relationship. So that would be awesome.
Yeah. Can you prove that you're my mother?
I have a birth certificate that I can prove that.
Because I look more like Dad than I look like you.
I know. So it's a good thing. Hey, Bet, you are my daughter on Ancestry DNA. So DNA proves it as well.
Oh, so, true.
Well, thank you for going through that whole case with us. I think it's so helpful to see how research is solved. And sometimes we see things like this, but we don't really take the time to understand each step along the way and how everything works together to prove it. So I think it's very, very helpful because I learned some different things about different steps. I had no idea about South Carolina and the districts and how that all worked. So thank you for researching that and helping us to understand so much about the area and the locality and how to discover a linkage back in the 1700s and early 1800s.
It was a really big learning experience for me, and doing this project during the study group was just a huge step forward in my skills. So I'm excited that we're doing another study group right now, and I'm working on another big brick wall on my husband's line, the Dyers. So I don't know if I'm going to have as great luck this time to be able to find the records that I need, but I'm hoping that we will find something about the Dyers in Tennessee. So as a conclusion, if you want to read all of the steps in my Lucinda Keaton case study, you can purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, and it's included in the online webpage for work samples for that. So check it out, and you can see all my examples in that. And we are done with today's episode, so we'll wrap it up and we'll say thank you for listening, and be sure to write us a review on iTunes or Stitcher and ask us your questions or leave us a comment that we can read on the podcast. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you guys next week.
Happy researching, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.